We can't just carry on chugging along, whistling and pretending that there's no problem. There really is. We are using our aid budget to give them a place to stay which is safe, near home, so that when the conflict is over, they can go back. If the government was an insurance company, like Aviva or the Prudential, running pension schemes and insurance companies, the regulator will be knocking at the door and shutting it down.
Hello and welcome to this IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the head of Media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the wonderful John Penrose. John is a recovering government minister, chair of the Conservative Policy Forum and is the director of Centre for Small State Conservatives. John, thank you for having me here. Well, thank you for coming here, sorry.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the big picture stuff going on in the UK at the moment. So obviously, a lot of the conversations at the moment looking at the reasons why Britain is currently declining. We're in economic ruin. Things are going down quite a negative path, and I don't think people really realise it, especially because we haven't seen an immediate market crash. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know a little bit about why you think this is the case at the moment and what you personally think the priorities should be.
Yeah, really important question, because as you say, we haven't had a single big event like a crash. It's been, I wouldn't say 1,000 cuts, it's more like 1,000 missed opportunities, actually, is really what's going on. Because what we haven't done as a country, and this is over successive governments, Labour, Coalition, Conservative, we haven't done the supply side reforms, the sorts of things that Thatcher did to fix the way the engine runs, the engine of our economy, and let it just rev a bit faster. And we haven't been doing that for such a long time. And as a result, the engine is sputtering. It's just not running the way it should. And that's everything from childcare through to house building, through to sound money and the government's finances themselves. Also, the energy markets, our railways, the list goes on and on and on of just problems which have not been fixed for decades. And as a result, there's a whole swathes of our economy which just aren't working nearly as well. And the really eye-opening thing is that if you look at what's happened, because we keep on comparing ourselves to our European neighbours, and that's fair enough. But economically, the really awful comparison is between ourselves and the US. And if you look at what happened there over the last 20 years, broadly speaking, they have carried on growing, and the effect of compounding has meant that the gap has gone from being relatively small in terms of relative wealth per person, as it were. They were ahead of us even then, but it's grown and grown and grown and grown, and that's really happened in the last 20 odd years, and maybe a little bit longer. And that is because we are not fixing these underlying problems. So we've got to fix them. We can't just carry on chugging along, whistling and pretending that there's no problem. There really is. And the good news is that the Conservative Party is actually the only party in British politics which has got any kind of a claim to be a history of fixing this stuff in its DNA. So if we're not going to do it, no one is.
And what do you think those solutions actually are? It's interesting, the comparisons to the US, because Mississippi is the poorest state in the US and yet still wealthier than the UK. And I don't think people really understand how poor Britain is. So what do you think the solutions are?
So I think it was Churchill who said about the Americans, he said they can normally be relied upon to do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else first. And I think that's kind of how we are in this country. We have tried absolutely everything else in the last 20 years, except for facing these fundamental underlying problems. And it's going to mean taking on some pretty big vested interests. I gave a list just now. But if we're going to fix, for example, childcare, which is really important as an engine of economic growth, every single two-career family listening to your podcast will know the strains and stresses that it puts people under. And at the moment, we have an incredibly expensive, it's one of the most expensive systems in the G20. And so guess what? We have gender pay gaps. We have families struggling to make ends meet. And we have people who just basically can't take promotions or don't want to take promotions for entirely logical economic reasons. Now, that means we've got to take on the current industry that is doing quite nicely. Actually, in many cases, they're suffering quite badly as well. But we've got to take on the current industry and persuade them that this has got to change. And ditto for the rail unions, who have sort of made sure that we don't have a great rail industry. Ditto the energy industry, which has sort of become steadily worse and worse and worse, and the water industry, and on the list goes. All of those have very big status quo vested interests. Now, quite a lot of the time, those vested interests aren't actually terribly happy with, they can see that things are wrong. They just don't know what the right answers are. And I mentioned the childcare sector. An awful lot of people who work in the childcare sector are really unhappy with how things are. So there's an opportunity to persuade them that there is a better tomorrow. There's a better alternative. It's up to the Conservative Party to do that. It's not a simple political task. It's not a simple economic task either. But no one else is going to do it, so it's up to us.
So the childcare industry, I think, is a really interesting, very specific example of this. I mean, most economists that look at the gender pay gap will basically argue that the gap is due to the cost of childcare and the cost of motherhood. Now, I don't think we should ever be discouraging women who choose to become full-time mothers. I mean, I think it's fantastic.
It's a free country.
It's a free country.
Should be,
do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
But clearly there is a cost to childcare that is distortionate as a result of government intervention. And when it comes to things like the regulatory framework, it's one of those really weird industries where the government have overregulated the system entirely through things like child-to-staff ratios that are quite stringent in comparison to our European counterparts, and then subsidised huge amounts of it at the same time. So you're increasing the costs and then you carry on subsidising it.
And then you're surprised when the whole thing falls over. Yeah.
Exactly. So,
and you end up with shortages. Yeah.
Well, so what should we do?
So you've just summarised an awful lot of the problem really well. And I'd also add to your summary that at the moment, and I think the government's about to come out with some announcements about this week, at the moment, all the childcare provision is focused on school term times. But guess what? Actually,
people work the whole time.
But people work outside school term times, and parents do. And actually, quite a lot of the time, the childcare pressures that they're under are more difficult in the school holidays than they are during school time. So actually, what we have is an incredibly rigid supply. It's expensive, but it's also rigid and inconvenient and not aimed at what parents really need. And part of the problem, I think, is that for good original reasons, what we've done is we have said, look, childcare needs to be trying to fix all sorts of ills and wrongs in society to do with disadvantaged children. And the first few years of life, we all know, are incredibly important for, they're not the only thing that matters, but they certainly matter hugely for your future life chances. And as a party that believes in opportunity, I'm kind of keen on levelling those up. That's great. But what we've done is we've said everybody must have this really high quality sort of educational childcare. Whether or not actually their parents want or need that. And in some cases, it is really, really important for families that are in need of a lot of support because they've got particular issues. And there's a small number of families where that particularly matters. But for everybody else, actually, they don't necessarily need that. What they want is something which is available whenever they happen to be working a shift. So it's much more 24/7 than the current government proposals. And is probably a great deal simpler and cheaper. So actually what quite a lot of parents want is reliable, safe and timely glorified babysitting or something like that, rather than really, really high-end, very, very sophisticated educational provision. Now, at the moment, we're only doing the second of those, and we're doing it in a very expensive way, which means that there are shortages and people can't get on. There's waiting lists and all these other things. And actually, we're ignoring the large numbers of families who would want to take that promotion, work the few extra hours of childcare, do all these other things, if only they could organise childcare. And particularly if you are either a single parent or your parents, the children's grandparents don't live nearby, or whatever it might be, and you're in a line of work which isn't massively well paid, you aren't a sort of high-flying corporate lawyer or banker, then actually that just means you can't do it. And that's not right and it's not fair. And it's cramping the way our economy grows and develops as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially with the formalisation of childcare, because what has happened is, a whole host of English language requirements and, degrees and qualifications. I mean, quite frankly, for a child under the age of 5, you don't need a university degree, to be able to look after that child.
Well, it might be that if the child comes with a whole series of very serious domestic disadvantages because their family is a very complicated family and they've got some, then you might need to have somebody who's really, really expert in that particular case. But for an awful lot of other high-functioning families, actually what they want is somewhere safe and caring and loving and helpful, where they don't worry as they leave their child there in order to go and do their shift at Tesco's.
And their parents,
that's really matters.
Yeah. And their parents should be allowed to decide what is safe, caring and loving and what is an appropriate environment for them. It's interesting. So childcare is one industry in which it's a fantastic microcosm, I think, for the broader problem, which is that the state continuously gets involved in various different aspects of that, messes with the price mechanism, messes with supply through regulatory constraints. And
you're saying what I just said in much better and fancier economic. But you're right. You're absolutely right. That's the technical economic explanation for, exactly.
And effectively what's happening is you're restricting that supply, so it becomes a lot more difficult than that way. Now, one of the questions I have for you in particular is whether or not there is genuine political will for those difficult problems to be solved. Now, of course, within the Conservative Party, there have been huge conversations about what the future of conservatism looks like. I'm not sure, quite frankly, most Conservative politicians in the last 10, 15 years really understood what it meant to be a Conservative or had enough.
There have been a few of us who've been
But when we're looking at what the government spends money on, looking at public spending as a whole, if we want to talk about tax cuts, we have to first of all talk about reducing the size of the state. A lot of it is welfare and pensions and healthcare as well. But within those particular...
And increasingly debt interest, incidentally.
Increasingly debt.
That's another conversation, but keep going.
So what, do you think that there is a genuine will to have those difficult conversations, and where would you sort of look towards cutting public spending? What's your Afuera list?
So I covered it slightly differently, which is that I think that what we need to be asking ourselves as a Conservative Party is, yes, how do we come up with bigger citizens who need smaller governments? Is the Centre for Small State Conservatives, which I founded, that's our motto: is bigger citizens need smaller governments. And if we can reduce the demand for government, it isn't a question of saying you need help and we can't afford it, so go away. That's a very difficult political place to be for any party in any democracy. But if instead we say, no, we're going to make it so that you are properly, all of our citizens, as many as we can possibly manage, are as well prepared for a proudly independent life as they can possibly be. And therefore, they're just not going to need so much help from the state. And that means getting upstream from some of these problems and trying to do prevention rather than cure. And the old medical adage about prevention is better than cure is actually true economically as well. So if we can help people, we were mentioning childcare and helping people in those first crucial few years of life, so that they don't grow up with a whole series of different behavioural problems which have not been addressed, and therefore they are much more likely to become contributing, tax-paying, independent citizens of the UK. That's great. And that's absolutely what we should be aiming to do. And it will mean that actually all the other things that we then have to spend money on at the moment in later life to bandage the problems which we didn't address earlier on, they sort themselves out. So that is, I think, where we've got to go. And that means going upstream and solving things before they become problems. The same thing goes for pensions. I mean, the state pension is a pay-as-you-go system. How do we turn that into a fully funded system where actually when someone of your age gets to retirement, you aren't dependent on politicians pledging to keep the triple lock or whatever it's turned into by then forever and ever and ever, and you aren't dependent on political whim and fashion. Instead, you can say, no, I don't care about that because I've got, through the state pension, a personal pot of investments that will fund my pension and it's mine. Now, how do we get from where we are today, which is miles away from that, to there? It'll take a generation or two, because it's taken a generation or two for us to get to this situation as we currently are. But that is the long-term answer to these sorts of problems, so that actually the burden of funding the state pension in an ageing society doesn't fall on today's taxpayers. You can't do that tomorrow, but you can do it over a generation or two, and that's what we need to be addressing. And if we don't, then I'm afraid, the Conservative Party will be as bad as all the other political parties, and I don't believe we are.
Okay, very good. I think it's interesting when it comes to the state pension in particular, because there does feel as though there is a little bit of a generational divide. And, the state pension is just one of many areas in which, even, public sector pensions, the liabilities that the government have. The problem is basically unfunded pensions.
Yeah, we don't have a balance sheet. The government doesn't have a balance sheet. And, no company or charity is allowed to function without a balance sheet. And yet, government says, oh, no, we don't need one of those. Those are for other people. Nonsense. Absolute rubbish, because it's the taxpayer who funds the fact that the state's balance sheet is completely shot. If the government was an insurance company like Aviva or the Prudential, running pension schemes and insurance companies, the regulator will be knocking at the door and shutting it down. It's that bad.
Yeah.
So we've got to do this.
The state pension is effectively a Ponzi scheme in which I feel extremely sorry for.
I don't think it's quite fraudulent, but
Well, I think it is. But in so many ways, people have been told their entire lives, you pay national insurance. That's really what it is, right? It's a miscommunication, but I think in some ways a bit of a lie. You're telling people you pay national insurance your entire life, and when you reach pension age, you take that money out of that little pot that has been waiting there for you. That pot doesn't exist. The money's already been spent.
And it should, yeah.
It absolutely should. Okay, so we've discussed pensions. The other end of
We're putting the world to rights.
We really are. We have to. So the other side to this is working age people.
Yes.
Now, I'm a member of Gen Z. I'm 23 years old, so I know that it is very difficult for young people who don't have a stake in society, who feel as though, I'm never going to be able to own a home, and the regulatory burdens make that too difficult. What do you think about the problem of working age people signing themselves off on long-term sickness benefits and being unable to contribute to the workforce? How would you liberate the labour market and ensure that the other end of the spectrum, people are actually able to work?
Yeah, and that the problem is just as you described it, and is exactly the opposite from my centre's motto of bigger citizens needing smaller governments. It's precisely the other way around from what we should be aspiring to. So I think there are a couple of things that we want to do, or we should do. One of them is whenever we talk about benefits and the benefit system, we always talk about whether or not people should be getting them, whether or not they should have access to them in the first place. That's an important facet. It matters. But we never talk about how you get people off benefits once they're on them in the first place. Because actually, unless you are one of the unfortunate people, there is a small number, but they clearly exist, people who have a very, very long-term sort of permanent health impairment of some sort or whatever it might be. For everybody else, the welfare state for working age people was supposed to be temporary help while you get yourself back on your feet and get back to a different job somewhere, and off you go. And you go back to being independent and tax paying and all those other good things which I and the Conservative Party and the IEA ought to agree with. So how do we do that? Well, at the moment, it's actually really hard, having got onto benefits, to get off them on the other way around. And we should be making it much, much easier. So one of the ideas which we've been publishing at the centre is to say, really what we ought to be doing is just to say, look, when you get yourself a new job, having been claiming benefits, at the moment, there are all these cliff edges, and you can suddenly find you are worse off because you lose a couple of benefits that you didn't know you were going to lose because there's some obscure, weird rule that nobody knew about, and then your benefits check comes in, and you go, flipping heck, actually, I shouldn't be working those extra 3 hours of overtime because it's left me worse off. That's clearly wrong, and so therefore, one of the things which I think we should be doing is say there should be a standard way of taking money back from your benefits, the equivalent of a tax rate, if you like, and when you start earning, that tax rate can never be higher than the top rate of income tax. So, if we think that it is a serious disincentive for really high-paid people to lose more than 45p in the pound in tax, and we do think that, and that's why the top rate isn't higher than 45p in the pound, for the moment at least, until Rachel Reeves does her budget this autumn. If we think that's a really serious disincentive to have top rate taxes that are higher than 45p, why do we think it is sensible for low-paid people to have withdrawal rates, total tax withdrawal rates, when their benefits of 70p in the pound or more, and in some cases over 100 pence in the pound? That's clearly bonkers. How can we think it is sensible to get people off benefits if the disincentives to work are twice as much, or nearly twice as much, as they are for high-paid people? These people are not stupid. They're poor, but they are not stupid. They respond to economic incentives just the same as everybody else. And so what we need to do is to just simplify that system. We can do that. It would be a bit of a rework in DWP and in the tax system in HMRC, but we could do it and just think of the number of people who would then know with confidence that if I do those extra 2 hours of overtime or I take that promotion, I know I'm going to be better off because I know I can't be taxed at more than 45p in the pound. It's simple, it's predictable, it's straightforward, it's safe, it's not scary. And if it's right for a banker or a corporate lawyer, why isn't it right for someone working a couple of shifts at the local supermarket as well?
You're absolutely right. And those economic incentives matter, don't they? Because if you are a person that is going to be worse off working, clearly,
or you're scared you might be, and you can't tell, which is equally as bad, right?
Yeah, I think the confusion is a huge part of it. I mean, Fraser Nelson did a fantastic documentary with Channel 4.
Done some really good work on this.
It's really, really interesting because you can sort of look at those individual people. There was a woman called Amy who's 30 years old, and she was saying, look, if I want to work, she was suffering with a whole host of mental health disorders. And she said, look, she wants to work, but if she was in work, she'd basically need to be earning about £35,000.
How bonkers is that?
You know, it's in order to account for housing benefit, universal credit, personal independence payments, all of the above. Now, some of those benefits you are allowed to take on even whilst you're working, but there are these cliff edges which make it so much.
And some of them are hard to spot in advance.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, so that's a really good example. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens of other things. Now, if you've got somebody with something like a mental health issue, some mental health issues are temporary; they come and they go. Others reoccur throughout your life. What we should be doing as a society is saying, how do we equip someone like her to cope when she's having a bad moment or a bad couple of weeks or a bad couple of months or whatever it is? How do we help her cope so that she doesn't lose her job at that moment? She gets through it with a bit of help and then can carry on. And so she stays living as an independent citizen, as she is best able. That's where the welfare state should be, I think.
I think it's a bit of a trap, isn't it, when you get into that situation, because there are lots and lots of people that want that. They want to work, they want to contribute. And I remember I first heard this argument actually made by Lord Lilly, who said, as soon as you bring those people onto long-term sickness benefits and you take, they're not counted in unemployment statistics, you're actually taking away their dignity, the reality that when you're working, when you're contributing, when you feel as though you have something to get up for in the morning, of course that has an impact on your mental health.
And so it's what the social scientists and the economists, so since you're the one quoting the economist stuff, it's what they call agency. Yeah. And if you just don't feel like you're in control of your own life, then it's much harder to get out of bed on a Monday morning and keep going.
And another aspect of public spending that I think needs to be discussed before we talk about a small state is healthcare. Yeah. So, when you look at a chart of what the government spends money on, as you said, debt interest payments are one of them, pensions and welfare, as we've discussed, and healthcare is a huge, enormous expense. I mean, the NHS is now the 5th largest employer in the world. We spend just below 200.
Is it overtaking the Red Army?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe that's been updated. I don't know. But it's huge, right? It's absolutely insane the amount of money that we spend, but it doesn't seem as though the more we sort of shovel taxpayer money into that bureaucratic black hole that we actually get better healthcare.
Yeah. So the really worrying thing here is not that the NHS doesn't need more money. We're an aging society, and healthcare technology is getting better all the time. So we're always going to have to put incrementally a bit more money into the NHS. The question is, are we getting a bang for our buck? Are we getting good quality for it? And if you look at what other countries around the world, developed countries, which spend about the same proportion of their national income on healthcare as we do in the UK, quite a lot of them, not all of them, but quite a lot of them actually have better life expectancy than we do. And if you really want to just say, well, is our health system really working? What's your healthy life expectancy is a quite a good way of looking at it at the country level. I mean, obviously not at an individual level, but at the country level. How long do we expect to live, and how well do we live during those years? And at the moment, we are not top of that tree. Now we're well ahead of other countries that spend. America, for example, spends loads more money on its healthcare and gets worse outcomes than us, which just shows you that that is not a system we should be copying. But there are other countries that spend about the same as we do and have better life expectancy. And so there's a whole series. You're tempting me. It's written, but it's not yet published. There's going to be something coming out from the Centre for Small State Concerted about how we can help the NHS. And there's some really, really dedicated people working, their fingers to the bone in the NHS. How do we get the NHS as a system to match the best of the rest of the world? And that is not an easy thing. And it's got to be something which is done, in conjunction with the high-class doctors and medics in the NHS. You can't just have people in Whitehall who think they know best.
Yeah.
Or trying to sort of do brain surgery with boxing gloves and a very screwdriver. You know, that it's just not going to work. You can't have central mandates, because that's not going to happen. But you are right. Any political party that doesn't have a proposal for how we're going to get the NHS to be what it could be just isn't trying hard enough.
The NHS is a really interesting example, I think, of a situation in which so the IEA obviously exists in so many ways to talk about, real fundamental change. It's the hard problems that politicians can't talk about. And the NHS is one example in which, 20, 30 years ago, we were so far outside of the Overton window. What was politically possible, we were saying, we should probably transition to a social health insurance model, and people screamed Bloody Mary after they had that, right? Now it's a lot more politically acceptable, and actually, the IEA's position 30 years ago, or even when we found it, is sort of now within the acceptable window frame of what is allowed to be said. And this has changed, literally in the last 5 years since the pandemic. People are now much more aware of the fact that the NHS is broken and that European models are better. There was some YouGov polling that was published last year that said there are increasing numbers of people in Britain that understand that there are European healthcare systems that are better than ours, which is insane, because that was completely politically impossible to say.
Yeah, but it happens. But it's an inconvenient truth.
It's an inconvenient truth.
Yeah.
So what do you make of those arguments that actually the NHS as a system needs to be transitioned, that the problem is the lack of competitive market mechanisms, perhaps something like the Netherlands, for example, in which you do get health insurers, the government provided a statutory minimum package?
You're tempting me to say what's going to be in this thing, which is not yet produced by the centre, and it's not quite finished yet. So I probably can't commit too much. But let me just say this: I don't think that any one European country's recipe can just be lifted up and just dropped down in the UK and applied here. That wouldn't work. But I do think that there are definitely elements of a number of different European countries. You mentioned the Netherlands, but it's not the only one by any manner of means, particularly those that have better life expectancies than we do for an equivalent, roughly, level of national income, that we should be looking at really seriously. And we need to be humble here and say we're spending a lot of money, and we deserve it to do the right thing by our own citizens, by our own taxpayers, by ourselves. But also, if I keep on going back to this point about bigger citizens need smaller governments, living a proudly independent life, it's much, much harder to live a proudly independent life that doesn't need so much help from the state if you're ill.
Yeah.
It just you end in this doom loop if you're not really careful. So even if you've got some really serious long-term condition, how can we just make you more functional, more able to be independent? You may not be completely independent in the way that you perhaps were before you got whatever the condition is, but how can we help you get back towards that? And if you talk to people who are dealing with who are facing long-term disabilities, some of them are really inspirational, because what they talk about is saying, this is how my life is now. There's no point in harking back to what it used to be. How can I live the best life now? And it's a really impressive attitude. How do we sort of bake that into the way that we are dealing with our health system, and so it gets more people back on their feet and able to live that independent life?
I think it's really interesting listening to you talk about the problems of the size of the state. Of course, as a politician, you are one of a very small minority that was sort of talking about this, but also, thinking about, you can't separate any of this stuff from the politics of it, which is very, very tough. And, even this Labour government have tried to make cuts to, for example, welfare spending, and were met with huge backlash. Huge backlash from their own party members.
I think it's actually harder for them, given their political hinterland.
It is.
To do some of these things than us. I think there are one or two things that it might be easy. If
the NHS, I think,
if West Streeting can do some of these reforms to the NHS, or a set that gets closer to what I'm talking about, then I think we should put up small statues in his name. But because I think he starts from a position where he'll have more trust. Whether or not he'll do it, only time will tell.
And it takes that conviction, right? Because the amount of times I've heard politicians, at least to my face, or indeed in conversations or on television, say the difficult things when they are not in power
Yeah.
and not in government. And then as soon as they have a whole bunch of civil servants telling them what is going on and
You're
giving
being
them...
very brave, Minister.
Yes, exactly.
It's always the danger signal. Yeah.
And when that happens,
Yes.
how do you make it so that when a political party or a politician is in government, they are not just completely seated by, I suppose, what some people have called the Whitehall machine, but that kind of feeling of big government where it's so difficult to actually get anything done?
So I think there are a couple of points to make there. One is that it's always easy for weak ministers, no matter which political party is in power, to blame their civil servants, to blame their officials, to blame the blob. And actually, my experience of officials and civil servants is if you give them strong leadership and you take them with you, you can they will be professional and they will do their absolute damnedest to help you deliver whatever it is that you're trying to do. But you do need to give them that strong leadership. You've got to walk in the door with a vision and a plan about what you're going to try and achieve. And if you turn up without those things, don't be surprised if it doesn't go terribly well.
Yeah.
So I think that's step one. Step two is I think an incoming government, and this is easier when you are starting and when you a new government that's just won an election sort of thing, you've got to try and change some of the rules by which Whitehall works. So, for example, you mentioned regulatory burdens and red tape just now. I want to see a system, and we've already talked as well about the government not having a balance sheet and therefore being able to pretend that all those off-balance sheet liabilities don't exist in the state pension system and that sort of stuff. Now, we could, if we wanted to, on the first day of a Conservative government, say we're going to change the fiscal rules, so the cost of the regulatory burdens is now going to be part of the government's budget. We're not going to just spend the money as though it's free, and we're going to treat it with the same seriousness as we currently treat money that has to be raised through taxes. And we're also going to publish a balance sheet, and the balance sheet is going to show that it's got a massive, great big black hole in it to begin with, because that's what we've inherited. And we're going to try and improve it little by little each year. Won't be by a huge amount, but the direction will be clear. And we're going to bake those into our fiscal rules, and we're going to make sure that therefore everybody knows what they are. And so we'll make them, we'll pass an act of parliament so they can't be changed when it gets inconvenient later down the road. Now, if we did that, that's kind of changing the rules of the game. It's changing the background which the officials work by. And the officials are, like ministers, they are legally obliged to follow the law of the land. So if you change the rules of the game, they will do it for you, and it'll be easier for incoming ministers to persuade them that here's what we've got to do instead. So those two things, I think, are the sort of the starting point. And anybody who tries to pretend that it's something else, I suspect probably just trying to cover up for the fact that you just need better ministers sometimes.
Okay, it's interesting. The legal obligations, I think, are specifically interesting because it basically bounds politicians to do the right thing. I mean, Hayek famously said, you want to be in a situation in which politicians are required to do the right thing, even if they're not the right thing, if that makes sense.
Indeed. And with the proviso, of course, that, if you've got a legal obligation which over time becomes out of date, Parliament can change it. I mean, that's the whole point about a parliamentary democracy. So that's okay. But it does mean that, therefore, if you pass an act of Parliament, that is constitutionally Parliament controlling the executive and making sure it does what Parliament wants in line with the democratic will of the people. That is, it is constitutionally impeccable for Parliament to do that.
Okay. And the future, let's talk about the future a little bit, because I think it's interesting thinking about the way in which the Conservative Party, but also other parties, the rise of Reform UK has been astronomical, and it has, of course, been seeded by a lot of the conversations around immigration. Now, I just know that we will get comments unless we talk about immigration at least once. So let me ask you a bit about that. I mean, as a libertarian, I think it's a really interesting conversation, especially when the welfare state is so large. I mean, I basically think that we should be in a situation like Dubai, where if you want to come here and work and contribute and, completely financially be responsible for yourselves, be our guest. But if you don't, we're not going to pay for you. We're not going to give you a single penny of taxpayer money, and you're probably going to have to go home. That's kind of, I think, effectively what the Conservatives are proposing on the opposition day, I think it's this week, with the deportation bill. If you can't get indefinite leave to remain until you've been here for 10 years, and after 5 years, you're not going to be getting the free healthcare and the benefit access and things like that. What do you think about this?
So I think that the problem which we got at the moment is that actually there's two different bits on there. One is the legal migration, which is people who turn up with a visa, and that's actually been historically much, much, much bigger number than the illegal arrivals in small boats, and before that in the back of lorries on the Channel Tunnel. And what we've done for the last 10 years in particular, I'm afraid, is we've been too generous with our visas. So that's step one. Now that is something which actually the last Conservative government in its dying days took the right steps to fix. So that is a problem which is being solved at the moment. I suspect I'm almost certain that the Labour Party will claim all sorts of credit for the decision which was taken by the last Conservative government. But that is something where the tap you can turn on and off, and that's already been done. And that bit of the system kind of works. The problem is the illegal arrivals. As I said, it's probably been going on for a great deal longer than people think, but it was just harder to spot when people were arriving in the back of lorries, and then they developed decent lorry scanning technology, and they started coming across in boats. Everyone went, we can see them. But it's been a problem for a long time, right? And it really it's a really socially corrosive thing because they're illegal, because they are arriving without permission, and they're jumping the queue in a sort of British sense. So
I like that.
But the difficulty is that, and there's a problem for I think politicians of every single party at the moment. It isn't just a question of the human rights law. It's also a question of refugee status. And the Refugee Convention was written after the last World War. It was written for a world where travel was a great deal more expensive. Social media to show that I'm living a great life in whichever country I've fetched up in didn't exist. And the number of people who were at risk and well-founded fear of persecution, everyone was rightly, I think, worried about the Jews in the wake of the Holocaust, but the number of other groups that were identified as being in that kind of position was many, many times smaller then. There may have been other groups that weren't identified, but everyone thought the numbers were very, very smaller than they are now. And so the difficulty is that you've got an awful lot of people who legally qualify as being potentially eligible for asylum in a way which didn't before. And until our national debate starts really addressing that really that really fundamental difficulty, which is that we're working off a convention which is over half a century old and was written for a different time. I just don't think that any party, and my own party is really trying to fix this, but we're picking on individual bits of it, individual bits of the problem. We've got to address all these other areas as well. Otherwise, it's all very well to say we're going to, as Reform just did, we're going to deport people no matter what. If somebody has come from a part of Ethiopia which has got or Sudan, then actually sending them back there is a death sentence. If they've managed through some miracle to get out of Gaza, are you going to send them back to Gaza? Really? So the difficulty there is we've got to come up with something which deals with those hard cases at the same time as we stop pretending that people who are claiming that they are under a danger of persecution, but who are really economic migrants, we've got to find a much better way of approaching it. And genuinely, if you've got somebody who's turning up from a war-torn country, I don't think that the over half a century old distinction between an economic migrant and an asylum seeker is terribly meaningful anymore. Or either that, or the entire country's population from one or two of these countries must qualify. That can't be right. That's not it. There's not a valid way of running any kind of system of dealing with need, or of trying to make sure that the British taxpayers aren't being taken advantage of either. Somewhere in the middle of that, we have got to rethink this, because we're working on something which is so out of date that it's just palpably not working anymore.
I think that's such a really interesting example of where, the particular legal definitions have sort of been co-opted, I think. There's also the fundamental point, and the reason why immigration wasn't one of the first things I asked you about is because the actual economic cost of immigration in comparison to things like the pension system and healthcare and welfare and debt interest payments is a drop in the bucket. Immigration is visible.
Yeah, it matters morally as well.
Yes.
And it gripes people. Yeah.
And it makes people very angry.
Yeah.
But if we are talking about the cost of the state, the reason why taxes are so extremely high and why they're going to have to go up this year and why they're probably going to have to go up next year unless we fundamentally rethink what the government does, all of those reasons have little to do with immigration.
One thing I would just add to your question about immigration, which is during the Syrian war, I think it was during the Syrian war, it might have been during Iraq, I can't remember, there was a really big issue about whether or not people who were living in refugee camps funded by the British aid budget in country, in Syria, in Iraq, what they were going to do. And the answer which we gave at the time when we were in government was, we are using our aid budget to give them a place to stay which is safe, near home, so that when the conflict is over, they can go back.
Yes.
Rather than trying to get to either Britain or anywhere else and paying a small fortune and being potentially exploited in all sorts of horrible ways by trying to become part of the refugee flow. That is a far better solution for a very large number of those people who currently qualify under that outdated refugee definition I was talking about just now. It's a far better answer because actually most people want to go home.
Yes.
If they can. The trouble is they can't in many cases because it's too dangerous or whatever it might be. If we can solve that, again, it's this point about getting upstream from some of those problems. That isn't all the answer either, but it could be a big part of it.
I think so too, John. That's really interesting. Right, before we finish off, tell me all about the Centre for Small Government. I mean, what is this? What are you guys working on? Why did you set it up, and what were you trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, the short answer is it's designed and it was set up specifically to deal with a lot of the things we've been talking about during this conversation. The problem is that for the last 15 years of Conservative government, because of good and understandable reasons, we were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and then there was a Brexit referendum, and then there was a pandemic. We haven't had the time, the bandwidth, the focus on doing the stuff which actually only the Conservatives historically have been able to do, which is to do these supply side reforms, these kind of solving the really big, difficult structural issues. And as a result of that, people at the end of 15 years looked at us and went, hang on a sec, there's all these problems that you haven't flipping solved. And they threw us out. I don't think the Labour Party is going to be any better at it either, based on what they're doing so far. But actually, we have got to retool. This is part of what Kemi Badenoch is quite right in saying she wants to do this policy renewal process, which my other hat of chairing the party's internal think tank, the Conservative Policy Forum, is trying to help with as well. She's right. We've got to retool, we've got to rethink, and we've got to go back to that strand of conservatism which we last saw under Thatcher. And because there is no money, because taxes are an all-time high and the debt burden is so high at the moment, this may be the only game in town anyway, is to try and work out how you reduce the burden of government, how you reduce the size of the state, but do it in a way, as I said, which is creating bigger citizens who need smaller governments in the first place. If you can do that, then nobody else is going to do it. It isn't in the political DNA of the Liberal Democrats or the SNP or the Labour Party or even Reform. Nobody else is going to do it, and I think that it will be very, very credible because people will say, yeah, that's why those are the problems which we aren't seeing answers to, not workable, credible, believable, practical answers. And these guys actually have got some decent solutions to it. That's where we need to be, I think, as a party. And it's, as I said, it's part of our hinterland. It's part of what we have always been. We just haven't done very much of it in the last 15 years because of all these other things that have been going on. Time to get back to that and renew it, because you can't just go back to the answers of the 1980s. You've got to take those instincts and update them for the 2020s and the 2030s instead. It's half a century later. What does the next tranche, group of those things look like?
Do you think that your former colleagues and new Conservative members of Parliament agree with you on this? Do you think that there is a genuine appetite for big ideas for a smaller government?
I think some do. I mean, look, it's only one strand of Conservative thinking. There are lots of other strands of Conservative thinking, and that's part of the Conservative Party's secret of its success over decades. So I'm not going to try and say that those other strands of bits of conservatism don't matter. They do. But at the moment, given where we are as a country, given the fact, as I said, that the debt burden is so high, that the tax burden is so high already, and that there are all these fundamental problems which are to do with the way, structurally how we've set our society up, this is probably the one that's got the most promise. And so I hope to persuade more and more of my current and former colleagues that actually this is the only game in town. And the advantage is it won't cost the taxpayers an extra penny.
John, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to speak to you, as always.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. Where can people learn about your centre?
There's a website, Centre for Small State Conservatives. So do that, or Google me, and it should come up as well, John Penrose. And have a look. And if you disagree with it, I want to hear why. And if you agree with it, there's a newsletter comes out roughly once a month, which will give you all examples of the latest thinking.
Amazing.
And with any luck, some of it might even match what the IEA thinks too.
So thank you, John, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you want to learn more about what the IEA gets up to, then do consider becoming a member at insider.iea.org.uk.